6 brutal agents are at a table to unmask a traitor, but any attempt to lie or outsmart the others would result in being killed at the spot. The tale begins with George, a top-tier agent, needing a hushed late-night rendezvous with his superior. Navigating a bustling bar and crowded dance floor, he found his boss. They stepped outside for a private chat. George's boss confirmed his suspicions. A traitor lurked within their ranks. George received a list of 5 potential betrayers, including his own wife, Kathryn. Her name was present due to her top agent status and high-level security clearance, providing both motive and means. The boss stressed the necessity of reporting the truth. They had recently lost Severus, a critical device from the UK's cybersecurity center. Its intended use would cause widespread civilian casualties. George, however, requested a week, vowing to unmask the traitor himself, convincing his boss to hold off on reporting the list for now. Unbeknownst to them, their secret meeting had an observer. A few days later, George prepared a grand dinner party. He then sought Kathryn upstairs. George had invited the 5 individuals from the list, hoping to expose the traitor. This meant 6 people, including George and Kathryn, would dine. Kathryn also knew about the organizational traitor, expecting George to use a lie detector. His method, though, was subtler. George warned Kathryn not to eat the Indian chickpea curry, revealing he'd laced it with a truth drug. Kathryn paused, then nodded, understanding. Someone at that table was dishonest. The 4 invited guests gathered. Dr. Zoe questioned the sudden, exclusive invitation and the short notice. James, another guest, considered it normal, given their shared profession. He felt the presence of 2 married couples was typical for their line of work, something regular folks wouldn't grasp. Soon, the 4 arrived at George's home. Once they began eating, Kathryn spoke of a 2012 cyber war in Syria, mentioning she'd written code that infiltrated enemy mainframes, crippling their entire system. Clarissa, a guest, was genuinely surprised. She'd seen the impressive code but hadn't known Kathryn authored it. All 4 guests consumed the curry with the truth serum, and their inhibitions loosened. A plump man named Freddie blurted out that George had spied on his father. He described his father as a cunning, promiscuous intelligence expert whose wife found no proof of his infidelity. Freddie, also an agent, took matters into his own hands. George had filmed his father cheating and screened the video at a family dinner, ruining his father's career and marriage. Freddie scoffed, stating no spy would hire someone bested by his own son. George, sensing the drug's intensifying effects, suggested a game. Everyone sat around the table, each giving a New Year's resolution to the person on their right, like quitting smoking. When it was Dr. Zoe's turn, she gave a resolution to James, who was highly ambitious. Her resolution for James was to cease constantly striving for the top position. James simply smiled, remaining silent. Immediately after, the night's biggest argument erupted between Clarissa and Freddie, who were married. Freddie, humiliated and enraged by his secrets being exposed, yelled at Clarissa, denying an affair and accusing her of lying about a good man who loved her. He then brought up issues in Clarissa's family to wound her. But Freddie was stunned when George exposed him, just as he'd exposed Freddie's father. George named the hotel Freddie visited with his mistress, even knowing Freddie used work meeting times for their secret rendezvous. Clarissa, utterly distraught, seized a dinner knife and stabbed Freddie in the hand. The dinner party concluded chaotically. After everyone departed, Kathryn surmised George had used too much truth serum. George didn't dispute this. While cleaning, he discovered a torn movie ticket in the trash. The ticket's time indicated Kathryn should have been overseas. Could his wife truly be the traitor? George felt suspicious but kept it hidden. Meanwhile, George's boss rarely went home. But one night, after finishing his wine, his body uncontrollably shook, and he died. The next morning, George awoke early and made breakfast. He acted as if nothing was amiss, asking Kathryn if she wanted to see a movie. Kathryn mentioned a one-day overseas business trip on Wednesday. When George named the movie from the ticket he'd found, she claimed never to have heard of it. However, when Kathryn wasn't looking, George discreetly slipped his work ID card into her purse. Afterward, George went to work on time. He told the receptionist he'd forgotten his card and used his personal ID for a temporary pass. As soon as George entered the office, Freddie approached him, revealing their boss had suddenly died the previous night from heart disease. Freddie found it strange, given their boss's youth. He wondered if something suspicious was happening and asked George about the boss's recent work. George, of course, wouldn't confide in a suspected traitor. Immediately after, George went to Kathryn's office floor to retrieve his work ID card. Kathryn, in a meeting, handed him her work ID. George then proceeded directly to his wife's office. George first donned rubber gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. Then, he instantly turned on Kathryn's computer and checked her recent schedule. He saw she was slated for a business trip to Zurich that Wednesday, with specific map coordinates marked. George quickly jotted down these coordinates. After Kathryn's meeting, she went to the office of Dr. Zoe, head of the Signals Warfare Department. They sat and spoke in detail. Dr. Zoe needed to determine if the agents had any mental health issues. Kathryn admitted she still wasn't sleeping well and took a small amount of lorazepam nightly to aid sleep. Hearing this, Dr. Zoe subtly frowned. The amount Kathryn mentioned was just below the reportable level, leading Dr. Zoe to suspect Kathryn was concealing her true dosage. Kathryn immediately denied this, asserting she wouldn't lie about such a thing. Dr. Zoe had no choice but to conclude the questioning and release Kathryn. Simultaneously, after work, George went to his usual spot for wild fishing. Fishing was his way to relax and contemplate. While fishing and mulling over problems, he often generated new ideas. George took a small boat to the center of the lake. As he fished and considered the strange events of the past few days, his fishing line suddenly snapped. George looked toward the shore and saw James had found him again. He quickly returned to shore. James informed him of a significant development. He explained that their finance team, working with tax authorities, regularly checked banks and tax havens to ensure their fake identities weren't being used for secret overseas accounts. There had never been issues before, but this time they unexpectedly found someone had used the name Margaret to open an overseas account. This name, Margaret, was an old FBI fake name from 20 years ago, supposed to be blocked in their system. But just yesterday, a massive sum, 7 million British pounds, was withdrawn from that account. So, someone had stolen this secret identity to receive all that money. And where did the money go? To Zurich. George's heart sank. This new information strongly pointed to Kathryn's involvement. That evening, George and Kathryn watched a movie. While watching, George subtly observed his wife. It seemed she genuinely hadn't seen the movie before. Early the next morning, George took Kathryn to the airport for her business trip. As it was a classified mission, Kathryn didn't tell George why she was going to Zurich. But George needed to clear his wife's name and uncover the truth. So that night he visited Clarissa's house to ask for a favor. Despite their huge fight at the dinner party, Freddie and Clarissa were still together. You could call them a match for drama. Clarissa was in charge of headquarters' security camera footage. George needed her to briefly alter the camera's view the next morning so it wouldn't be locked and recording. Clarissa quickly refused. George patiently explained that during the brief camera view change, the satellite could be used for other purposes unnoticed. George had successfully done this on a previous mission. The next day, George arrived early at the location Clarissa had specified. He gave Clarissa the map coordinates he'd found on Kathryn's computer. They had only 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Time was dwindling. Clarissa quickly used the satellite to begin searching and finally located a bench in a square in Zurich. Then Kathryn appeared in their view. Clarissa looked smug, thinking George was also being deceived. Just then, a man sat next to Kathryn. George told Clarissa to zoom in closer and use facial recognition. They had only 1 minute left, so they needed to hurry. The next second, Clarissa identified the man. His name was Kulikov, and he was Russian. Then Clarissa used AI to lip read. They heard Kathryn seemingly buying something from Kulikov. With only a few seconds remaining, Clarissa tried to stop the operation but found she couldn't exit the system at all. In her panic, she missed their window of opportunity. Even after unplugging the AI, she finally exited the system, but the image remained on the big screen. George told Clarissa not to panic and to delete all operation logs to ensure no evidence remained. At the same time, Freddie, seeing something on his computer, quickly called George. When George saw it, he too was deeply shocked. Soon after, their boss held a secret meeting. It turned out the Federation had been constantly monitoring a Russian general named Vadim. He was collaborating with a group of exiled military leaders to overthrow the struggling Russian government impacted by the war. Rumors suggested Vadim possessed Severus. But strangely, early that morning, the satellite watching him suddenly shifted its view for 2 minutes. By the time it returned to normal, Vadim had vanished. How did the enemy know precisely when the satellite would switch unless someone inside their headquarters had informed them? When George heard this, his heart pounded. He realized that his and Clarissa's actions had unintentionally aided a dangerous person's escape. Then, their leader mentioned Kulikov's name again. It turned out Kulikov worked for Vadim. After everyone else left, the leader informed George, Freddie, and James that Vadim likely possessed Severus, explaining their surveillance. If Vadim transported Severus to Moscow, it would be catastrophic. Severus was a unique computer virus developed with the U.S. National Security Agency. It required physical insertion into a nuclear reactor to bypass security. Once inside, it could disable the reactor, causing a dangerous meltdown, a potent cyber weapon. They had realized Severus couldn't leave their building. If other nations acquired it, they too could cause nuclear disasters, posing a grave threat to the U.S. But now, someone had helped Vadim escape with the virus. The leader ordered the three of them to swiftly uncover the insider, using any means necessary. Following the meeting, George remained stunned. He hadn't anticipated Clarissa immediately divulging everything George had asked her to do to Freddie. Meanwhile, Kathryn's plane landed, bringing her home. But upon arrival, Freddie was already waiting. He briefed her on the day's events, warning that if Vadim reached Moscow, George would be blamed and could face 35 years in prison. Freddie then asked Kathryn if she knew why George had been watching her. Kathryn was unaware. That evening, Kathryn lay in bed. George suddenly turned over, feeling as though he'd been framed. Kathryn concurred. It was clear someone was trying to harm both of them. Someone was plotting against George, presuming he'd tried to protect his wife, which was precisely what was occurring. Because of this, George had fallen into a trap, inadvertently allowing Vadim to escape. If they investigated further, George would surely be seen as the traitor. And Kathryn's meetings with Kulikov would make it difficult for her to avoid suspicion. But George and Kathryn weren't about to passively await disaster. The next day, George returned to his fishing spot. This time, however, he specifically invited James to join him. They boarded the boat together. George informed James he planned a series of lie detector tests. James agreed but asked George who he suspected the insider was. George paused, then stated he wasn't yet certain. James then shifted the topic, discussing the bank incident. He revealed that his investigation showed Margaret was the name Kathryn used on her 2008 passport. The system had errors, and this passport had been used frequently for 10 years, with at least 40 to 50 entry and exit records. Meanwhile, Kathryn devised a plan to unmask the true traitor. First, she asked Clarissa to obtain Kulikov's location history. Then, she secretly arranged to meet a good friend working at the CIA. She knew anyone within the FBI could be the traitor. It turned out that after her meeting with Kulikov, she had secretly placed a tracking device on him. This time, she used her connections to have the CIA dispatch a drone to eliminate Kulikov and Vadim, citing them as a threat to national security. This would prevent anyone from accusing her of collaborating with Russians and halt Severus's transportation, solving two problems at once. Immediately after, Kathryn met with her boss, Arthur, at a sushi restaurant. She knew Arthur was definitely involved. Otherwise, someone of their rank wouldn't be able to harm her and George. Kathryn told Arthur he had to immediately cease his plan. Arthur chuckled, saying it was too late, instructing her to check the CIA drone status. Kathryn's actions made sense, as a nuclear meltdown would cause countless innocent deaths. No matter Arthur's anger, it was irrelevant. Simultaneously, a drone rapidly approached Kulikov and Vadim, then dropped a bomb, killing them both instantly. Meanwhile, George initiated the lie detector test. He asked basic questions, then more detailed ones, frequently changing them and sometimes suddenly asking, "Was it you who stole Severus?" The computer displayed everyone's emotional reactions, but George quickly noticed something odd. Everyone else showed strong emotional shifts, but Clarissa's readings remained consistently stable. Clarissa's composure made George suspicious. He immediately made the questions more difficult. After questioning her, he discovered Clarissa had read books on how to manipulate lie detectors by controlling her body's responses. After completing the tests, George invited everyone to his house for dinner again. If Arthur was the mastermind, then one of them must be his accomplice. This dinner was the chance to catch that person. Soon everyone had arrived. Kathryn announced the rules. She declared that everyone would take turns answering George's questions, and anyone who answered incorrectly would be punished. She then pulled a handgun from her bag, stating clearly, "Tonight, someone will not leave this house alive." Dr. Zoe sharply noticed the rug under the table had been replaced, realizing their hosts were serious. The mood in the room instantly turned chilling. To save themselves, the guests had no choice but to participate. George began with Dr. Zoe, asking, "When did you start having an affair with Freddie?" It turned out Freddie's secret lover was Dr. Zoe. Clarissa immediately felt nauseous. Dr. Zoe honestly admitted it had been about 7 or 8 weeks. Next, both Freddie and Clarissa answered George's questions correctly. Finally, it was James's turn. George asked him, "That night, did you intentionally throw the movie ticket in the trash so that I would suspect Kathryn?" James denied it. George continued to expose James's scheme. He explained that Arthur had initially suggested stealing Severus to James because it would destabilize Moscow, frame Kathryn, and remove George from the picture. A perfect plan. Later, James stole Severus and tricked Kathryn into going to Zurich, making her believe she was retrieving the virus. Then, he discarded the movie ticket to make George suspicious of Kathryn's schedule. James had also guessed that George would ask Clarissa to redirect the satellite to watch Kathryn, giving James the opportunity to let Vadim escape during the satellite's temporary blind spot. The final part of his plan was to blame George for being the traitor. This clever plan, however, had one fatal flaw. James had personally opened the overseas account in Myanmar. George then displayed a stack of photos of James at the Myanmar bank. Seeing the evidence, James stopped denying everything. He grabbed the gun and admitted he had done it all. He argued that he was right, as this was a great chance to weaken Russia. He even poisoned their superior for this purpose. He claimed that, without a confession, it was all just guesswork. But George unilaterally redirecting the spy satellite was a fact, enough to send him to prison for life. James was shocked to realize that George, the experienced agent, had secretly planted a recording device, and the gun James was holding was a fake. The situation instantly shifted. Afterward, George wrapped James's body in the rug and dumped it in his wild fishing spot. Arthur, also guilty, dared not say anything and had to treat James's disappearance as an accident. George and Kathryn's life returned to normal. Thank you